Opposition. Opposition. We will all face opposition if we do anything in our lives. Anything. We will face a lot of opposition, a lot of it personal, if we are leading something to try to accomplish something. This is true not only in our secular lives, it's also true in our religious lives. Steve left, I guess. Where are you? Oh, okay. I get the picture. When Steve asked me to talk about opposition, I don't think that he fully understood who he was asking. Because I can tell you, I have had some serious opposition in my life. Some of you may have been alive in 2005. Some of you read the newspapers in 2005. And you may have noted that in August of 2005, I was the subject of a 5-day series in the Rocky Mountain News. Oh yeah, it was impressive. They chose extremely flattering pictures of me to go along with the articles. Yeah, right. And that was because I had been on the board of a $40 billion organization for 18 years. And then they'd asked me to come on board the staff, and so I was the chief administrative officer of this $40 billion organization. And we were moving forward on some things to dollars, and when you have $40 billion, people tend to want your money. So they singled me out, and 3 days of their series, over 3,000 words of newspaper print, were devoted to telling people how awful I was. And in a lot of ways I was. But in their view, I was awful. Now, there's also opposition even from our friends sometimes. Some of my people that I had shared with my most intimate thoughts over a period of time, one of them met with the others and came up with a list of 59 things wrong with Kim Natale and chose to share those. Now, if you had asked me, I could have come up with more than 59. Because we always know what's wrong with ourselves. But yeah, I've faced opposition. So when he said, I want you to talk about opposition, I said, yeah, I've been through some opposition to things I wanted to do in my life. In fact, I know some of you, and a lot of you have faced similar opposition. Opposition in a lot of ways to things where you believed you were doing the right thing. So let's pick up with Nehemiah. I got to run these slides, right? Okay. I'm going to review what Steve told us about last week. Oh, Jerusalem destroyed in 586. Remember he told us that? And some of the people escaped to Egypt. Some of the people were taken captive to Babylon. And some of the people, especially the non-Jerusalem residents, sort of stayed in the area. So we had 3 big groups that were there. Well, this is still our review. In 538, a lot of the captives got to return. This is because the Babylonian king had lost his power. And the Persians had taken over the Babylonians, and the Persian king got tired of having a bunch of Jews in Babylonia. So he said, why don't you go home? And so several of them decided to go home. And he said, not only this, I want you to rebuild your temple. Well, initially when they got there, they just set up an altar. And when they set up that altar, they started to offer sacrifices. And they laid the foundation of the temple. But then the work stopped for 16 years because they got some opposition. People in the surrounding area didn't want a rebuilt temple. So work stops. And then God said, no, I want my temple rebuilt. So you can read in our Bible today, in the book of Haggai, in the book of Zechariah, how they prophesied and said, you guys need to get to work rebuilding this temple. And sure enough, construction restarted. And it took 6 years of work, and it was finished in 516. So it restarted 16 years after it had initially been laid. And in 516, the temple was rebuilt. Now, I got to tell you, this temple that's rebuilt is not like the old temple was. It's kind of a sorry substitute. More like what the tabernacle was when the Jews were wandering in the wilderness and had the tabernacle and they kind of set it up. That's what it was like. All right. Now, I got to introduce you to some of our characters today. Ezra. Now, Ezra is not with the group that goes back to Babylon. In fact, he stays, or that goes back from Babylon to Jerusalem. He stays in Babylon. In fact, he's probably not even born at the time, because in 458, that's 58 years after the temple is completed, he manages to get himself appointed the governor of the area. He hears sacrifices are not being done in the temple area, even though it was rebuilt. And so he heads back. So, I mean, that's 60 years later. You know, this is a long time. And so he gets the sacrifices going again. He spends a year getting the sacrifices going again, and then, for reasons that I don't want to go into today, the people stop listening to Ezra. They're kind of tired of his preaching. So they ignore him. And for the next 12 years, the sacrifices aren't offered on schedule. Which brings us to our friend Nehemiah. Now, Nehemiah decides 12 years after Ezra has given up, well, he's an important guy. But he's living in Susa, which is the winter capital of the Persian king. And he gets word that things are not going well in Jerusalem. Here's the word he gets. The word he gets is, those who survive the exile are back in the province. They're in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down. Its gates have been burned with fire. When I heard these things, Nehemiah says, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed to the God of heaven. Well, Nehemiah then takes it upon himself to do something. He decides to try to get permission to go back and build the wall of Jerusalem, and maybe if they could have a wall around the city, things would look better. Now, you got to think about a wall for a minute. You ever built a wall? I haven't really built a wall, unless you count retaining walls, railroad ties, and that kind of stuff. But I built fences, similar to a wall, right? A lot of discussion in the world today about building walls. All right, so I built a fence. You know why I had to build a fence? You build a fence for two reasons. One of two reasons, maybe both. You either want to keep things out or you want to keep things in. Nehemiah actually has both those things in mind. when we first built our house, behind our house, there was nothing but an empty field that they used as a pasture for horses. We had a fence, a wire fence, not barbed wire, just a wire fence across the backyard. Saturday, the sod guys finally came. When they sodded the yard, you then water your yard a whole lot. So the sod guys laid our sod in our yard on Saturday. Sunday morning, I woke up. I looked out in the backyard. I went to Georgia. I said, "Did you tell the guys laying the sod to lay it green side up?" She goes, "Well, I didn't think to tell them that." Because the sod is no longer green side up for about 6 feet our side of the fence. It's brown side up. I go, "This is wrong." I noticed what happened is the horses had come over and they'd reached their necks over our fence and they had pulled up the sod and they'd kind of chew on it a little bit and toss it around and throw it back down. So it was brown side up in my yard. Luckily, it was a Sunday. I went to be with my friends at church to worship God. And I asked one of the guys who knew something about horses. I just knew that they're uncontrollable beasts. I asked some of my friends, I said, "Well, what should I do?" He goes, "Come to my house, I'll give you what you need." So I go over to this guy's house. His name was Jerry Young. Some of you know him. Jerry gave me this thing that has an electronic control on it. And it has 10,000 volts, 20,000 volts, and 50,000 volts. Has a dial you can turn. And then he says, "Just take this wire and run it across the top of that fence. Put it on insulators." So I did that. I went out that afternoon when I got home, and I ran that wire across the top of that fence. And I go, "Man, those are big horses." So I took that dial and I cranked that baby all the way. Now, they'd seen me out there. Those horses had seen me out there. So they didn't come over for a while. In fact, I'll never forget it. We'd been watering the lawn, because you know how you do with sod, you water it a lot, so it was wet. And even on their side of the fence, it was wet in the field. And I remember the sun was just setting, and the horses are silhouetted against the sunlight as the sun goes down. And they're kind of in a group talking to each other, horse talk. I know a lot about animals. They're talking to each other, and they get in this group, and one of them, a big gray one, he comes over. He comes over near the fence, and you can see his eyes. His eye is looking over the fence, and it has a gleam in it like, "Look at that green grass," because I turned it green side up again. He's looking at that green grass. And he stretches his neck out. And he leans his neck over the fence. His lips get about that far from my grass. And in that twilight, I see a blue glow. A blue glow that goes from his lips to my grass. And I see that his hooves on the other side of the fence are also lit up blue, where he is standing in the mud on his side of the fence. Up. Isn't that what they call it? He rears up, and his eyes turn red. And he makes odd sounds. And he goes back down the hill where I can't see him. See, I built that to keep the horses out. And you know what? I called up Jerry. I said, "Hey, it worked." I said, "What should I do?" He said, "Take it down." I took it down. From that point forward, the horses never came in. They had learned something. Oh, it was fun. They had learned not to come on my side. Now, Nehemiah has a problem because the city of Jerusalem, there are bad people that could come in and steal stuff. So he wants to build a wall to keep them out. But he also wants to build a wall to keep people in because he wants a certain number of people to stay in the city. Now, I say that Nehemiah takes it upon himself because there is nowhere that I can find that God told Nehemiah to do this. We're going to talk about that in a minute. All right. Look at what Nehemiah says in Nehemiah 2:5. He's in Jerusalem now. He's got permission, and he is appointed as the governor of this area. He says, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my fathers are buried so I can rebuild it. He's telling the king, I want to rebuild this. This is after he prayed. He thinks that God wants him to rebuild the city, which God may want him to do. But I can tell you specifically, God does not want him to rebuild the wall. We'll talk about how I know that later. Now, he's going to have some opposition to this. He's going to have opposition in three areas. First area is he's going to have political opposition. The political opposition is in the form of this guy whose name is Sanballat. Sanballat is the governor of the province immediately north of where he is. I mean, 30 miles to the north, Sanballat is there. He's going to have opposition from wealthy people. The wealthy people is Tobiah. He's the rich guy in the neighborhood. And he's going to have opposition from the neighbors in the area. Let me tell you a little bit more about Sanballat. We don't learn a lot about him in the Bible, but we know a lot about him now. Because we know that Sanballat, he was a governor, just like Nehemiah. But we also know now that he was a faithful worshiper of God, the God of the Israelites, as a matter of fact. In fact, he had so much reverence for God that he named his children, and all of their names end with suffixes that indicate they are given to the God of the Israelites. How do we know this much about him? Because the Persians, if there's one thing they were good at keeping records. And so they wrote all this down. And we've unearthed some of those things. Archaeologists have found them. And they have also found that Sanballat had built a temple on Mount Gerizim. And you say, well, where's Mount Gerizim? Mount Gerizim is 30 miles to the north of Jerusalem. It's the mountain where when the Israelites first came to the land of Canaan, God had them offer sacrifices there. It's one of the highest mountains in the region. So on Mount Gerizim, he built a temple. And that temple was larger, the one he built was larger than the one in Jerusalem. The one in Jerusalem was only 90 feet by 90 feet. The one at Mount Gerizim was 130 feet by 130 feet. Now, it's hard for archaeologists right now to dig up the temple in Jerusalem. There's political obstacles. But it's easy for them to dig up the temple at Mount Gerizim, so they've done a lot of research on it. And they know that because they found multitudes of bones there, that huge numbers of sacrifices were made there. They also have all kinds of inscriptions that these were offered on behalf of themselves to God, the God of Israel. So Sanballat worships the same God. Furthermore, he'd really decorated his temple, and his daughter was married to the son of the high priest in Jerusalem, Eliashib. So Sanballat, he's a pretty well-connected, politically connected guy. Let's learn a little bit more about Tobiah. Well, they've also, by the way, Mount Gerizim is in today what we would call the West Bank. All right, Tobiah. Well, Tobiah also worshiped God. Now, he's the local leader. He's the wealthy guy. His palace has been found. In his palace, which is just outside Jerusalem, they have found all kinds of inscriptions that indicate this family had been wealthy for a long time. So he's been there a while, and his relatives had married priests in Jerusalem as well. In fact, he was so wealthy that he had a permanent chamber in the temple in Jerusalem. So this guy has a lot of money. We don't know much about the other guys, but we know that they were head of clans. So let's see what they do. The first opposition that Nehemiah faces is Sanballat's. And notice he behaves just like a politician. Look what he does. He ridicules the Jews. In the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he says, "What are those feeble Jews doing?" So he calls them names. And then he says, will they restore their wall? Will they offer their sacrifices? Are they going to finish in a day? Are they going to bring the stones back to life? And that burned out rubble, are they going to build that up? That's what he's saying. Do you realize that's a typical political opposition? Today we'd say it appears on the internet. And on the internet, what you do is you call people names. And so you start calling them all these names. That's what politicians like to do. And so you don't really attack their project. You say, oh, they're feeble Jews. They're building, they just got lousy building materials. They're just putting it together. It's nonsense. Of course, Tobiah has to get in on this too. But because he's a wealthy guy, he says, what are they building? If even a fox climbed up on it, he'd break down their wall of stones. In other words, why don't you spend some more money and do it right? Well, the reason is you don't have any more money, you sorry people. So he opposes the wall as well. Well, Nehemiah gives a response to this. His response is to pray. I think that's a good response. I can tell you that when I face opposition, on my good days, that is my first response. Hear us, O God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders. Do you find this a little bit of an odd prayer? Do you find out, as you read that, does that meet your qualifications for a prayer today? Look at what he says. Hear us, O God, because we are despised. We would pray that. But then, do you pray, make those suckers pay? You see what he's saying? That's what his prayer is. He says, make those suckers pray. He says, turn them over to be captives, just like we were. Make them captives. Give them as plunder into a land of captivity. Go ahead, God, do it to them what you did to us. Don't cover up their guilt or blot out their signs. They've thrown insults at us. Go get them, God! I find that an interesting prayer. Maybe they prayed different in those days, but sometimes, aren't our prayers kind of like this? Amazingly, the work continues. Now, Nehemiah doesn't really rely totally on his prayer, does he? Because what does he do? And we had the reading that you gave us, which is great. Because what does Nehemiah do after this prayer? He does something himself. He posts guards, and the families are there, and half of the people get to work, and half of the people have to serve as guards. You know how I would have liked to see this prayer? If I were writing the Bible, here's what I'd do. I say Nehemiah's prayer was, God, protect us from these people. And the next day, they went out and continued the work, and God protected them. That's my version. That isn't the version that we have. Now, the next opposition he faces is his own workers. The workers want to quit. Working on the temple has caused problems for them because it apparently is time when they should be growing their own crops. It's a difficult thing because it was a famine at that time too, so it was hard to grow crops. And so because they had to buy food somewhere, they had sold their own sons and daughters as slaves, and they'd mortgaged their fields just to get food. You know how Nehemiah addresses this? He goes to the people, the priests and the nobles and the officials. He gets them together. They're the ones that were forcing the people to sell their sons and daughters to them as slaves. They're the ones that are holding the mortgage notes, and he says, release the people from all this stuff. So he gets them, the rich people, to release the people from their obligations. Third thing they do to oppose him, it's the simplest solution. Being Italian, I understand this one the best. The best thing to do if you want to get rid of your opposition is just to kill him. So what they do is they can't really kill him in the city because he's pretty protected in the city. He's got these people all around him. So 5 different times they send notes to him and say, hey, come on out of the city. We want to discuss this with you, all right? We want to talk about this. And they plan to kill him if he comes out of the city. Well, Nehemiah says, I sent this reply. This is after the 5th time where they accused him of plotting against the king of Persia. He says, I sent him this reply. Nothing like what you're saying is happening. You're making this up out of your head. They're trying to frighten us. They're trying to frighten us. And thinking their hands will get too weak for the work and it will not be completed. But I prayed, now strengthen my hands. I like this prayer. Because now Nehemiah is understanding what he needs to do. Okay, well, they couldn't get him out of the temple, so now we have kill Nehemiah attempt 2. They decide, let's get him into the temple. Because who do we know is the priest in the temple who is allowed to be there? Well, remember that the Sanballat, his daughter, is married to the son of the high priest. Well, the high priest has access to Nehemiah and access to the temple. So if we can get him in the temple, we can kill him there because he doesn't have his protective detail in the temple. So let's get him into the temple. Then we can kill him. Well, Nehemiah sees through that. He gets word and he understands with the word going on. Nehemiah 6 says, but I said, should a man like me run away, or should a man like me go into the temple to save his life, I will not go. Now here's what he means by that. The first sentence, should a man like me run away, I'm the governor. I don't run away from anybody. Second thing is, Nehemiah had been the cupbearer to the king of Persia. The queen was often present. In fact, the Bible records that if you're reading Nehemiah. She was often present with him. Anyone who served with the king and queen was not just a cupbearer. Nehemiah was a eunuch. Because he was a eunuch, if he would go into the temple, that was forbidden. So he's saying, you're trying to trick me in two ways. First off, I know you got friends in there that are going to try to kill me, but I don't run away because I'm a governor. Second thing is, I can't go into the temple because then you could accuse me of violating God's word, and then it'd be right for you to kill me. So that's what he means by that. I'm not going. Amazingly, the wall's completed. The wall's completed in only 52 days. That's kind of stunning when you think about it. Now, it's true, it's not a very good wall, but it's a done wall. And it's done enough that people can't get in. I mean, it's good enough that it was like my wire going across, right? That nobody's going to, they learned their lesson. They're not coming in. It's good enough. He got it built. Nehemiah remained the governor for 12 years, and then he gets recalled to Susha. And after a short time, he comes back. And you know what happens when he comes back? He comes back, and the people have quit offering their sacrifices again. On a side note here, the temple is finally rebuilt in about 40 A.D. by Herod the Great. 40 B.C., I'm sorry, by Herod the Great. Herod is not even a Jew under their definition of being a Jew. And so the guy who, I think that's ironic, God does these ironies to us all the time. God allows a non-Jew to build his temple. Pretty stunning. So you got to ask, with all this opposition, was Nehemiah successful? And the answer, I think, is, yeah, he did rebuild the wall, right? He got it done. Building the wall was really important to Jerusalem. It allowed it to become a real city. It allowed it to be protected. It allowed people to live there. But on the other hand, the people went back to their old ways. Now, he leaves for 2 years, and he comes back, and people are back doing what they were before. So he didn't change the hearts of anybody. So was he successful or not? I mean, how would you judge your own success? I got people to do it when I was there, but as soon as I left, they went back doing whatever they wanted. Wow. I think he did some things wrong. Nehemiah was a great guy, but like us, he was human. He did some things wrong. First thing he did wrong, he should have checked the prophet's writing from 80 years before. 80 years before, Zechariah had written, and he had written to Zerubbabel, who was in charge of building the temple. And when he had written to him, here's what Zechariah says, "Run, tell that young man, Jerusalem will be a city without walls because of the great number of men and livestock in it, and I myself will be a wall of fire around it, declares the Lord, and I will be its glory within." God's intent was that Jerusalem not have walls. Maybe Nehemiah should have checked before he thought God told him to build a wall, whether God wanted a wall. Second thing, maybe he should have learned from an earlier failure and worked with the surrounding people to get their cooperation. Wouldn't that have been a nice thought? Here's the earlier attempt. This is clear back when Zerubbabel gets back there. This is 90 years before. When the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the exiles were building a temple for the Lord, the God of Israel, they came to Zerubbabel and to the heads of the families and said, "Let us help you, because like you, we seek your God and have been sacrificing to him since the time of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who is with us here." These people, what did they do? Well, they got turned down by Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel says, "I don't want your help. Get out of here. We're going to build it ourselves." 90 years later, what had they done? They'd built their own temple. bigger and better. Third thing. Oh, I should finish this. Zerubbabel, Joshua, and the rest of the heads of the families of Israel said, "You have no part in us with building the temple to our God. We'll build it alone for the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, commanded us." So they refused help. What's the third thing he should have done? When you get something done, you ought to give God credit for the success. Now, I love Nehemiah. I think he is a man trying to serve God, but I have some problems. I have some problems with what he does here. Moreover, from the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, until his 32nd year, 12 years, neither I or my brothers ate the food allotted to the governor. But the earlier governors, those preceding me, by the way, who was that? That was Ezra. Those preceding me, they placed a heavy burden on the people, and they took 40 shekels of silver from them in addition to the food and wine. Their assistants lorded over the people. But out of reverence for God, I didn't act like this. Instead, I devoted myself to the work on this wall. All my men were assembled there for the work. We didn't acquire any land. Furthermore, 150 Jews and officials ate at my table, as well as those who came to us from the surrounding nations. Each day, 1 ox, 6 choice sheep, and some poultry were prepared for me, and every 10 days an abundant supply of wine of all kinds. In spite of this, I never demanded the food allotted to the governor, because the demands were heavy on these people. Remember me with favor, O God, for all I have done for these people. Whoa, do you have a problem with that? I am a lot like Nehemiah when I actually look at my life. Because sadly, when I do accomplish something, those rare moments, when I accomplish something, I tend to think, look what I did. That's what Nehemiah does here. And I think it's wrong. Here's what I get from this. Probably not the lesson you expected today. When we're asking ourselves, should I do something? I would suggest we approach it in 4 easy steps. You should ask yourself first, is what you want to do prohibited by your reading of the Word? In other words, look at the Word. Is there a prohibition to you doing this? You know, you see this cute woman walking by, and you're a married guy, and you say, I think I should have an affair. Maybe it's prohibited by the Word. Maybe you ought to read it. If it's not directly prohibited by the Word, and I find a lot of things I do they're not really covered. The general thing is, does it encourage love for God and love for other people? In other words, does it meet the basic criteria God gives us? Does it praise God, or does it benefit other people? Next thing you ought to ask yourself is, are you willing to work with others who love God, who are from different faith communities? They may not see God exactly the way you do, but can you find some common ground? And the last thing I'd say is, do you make sure you give God the credit when it's done? So where are we at? God gives us Nehemiah not to say, continue in the face of opposition no matter what. He gives us Nehemiah to say, maybe there's a reason you're facing opposition. Now, you will still face opposition even if those reasons go away, but at least make your life a little easier by being somewhat sensible. Reason, think. So I would challenge us in our lives to do that this week, to do these 4 steps. Whenever you're facing a problem in your life, ask these 4 questions.
Three things are about to happen. First thing that's going to happen is those green cards I asked you for are going to start moving towards the center aisles. Second thing that's going to happen is if there are prayer needs, prayer requests, our shepherds are going to be at the back waiting expectantly to pray with you and over you. And the third thing that's going to happen is you're going to stand and sing with me. To Canaan's land I'm on my way, where the soul never dies. My darkest night will turn to day, where the soul never dies. Dear friends, there'll be no sad farewells, there'll be no tear-dimmed eyes. Where all is peace and joy and love, and the soul of man never dies. A rose is blooming there for me, where the soul never dies. And I will spend eternity where the soul of man never dies. Dear friends, there'll be no sad farewells, there'll be no tear-dimmed eyes. Where all is peace and joy and love, and the soul of man never dies. A love light beams across the foam, where the soul of man never dies. It shines to light the shores of home, where the soul of man never dies. Dear friends, there'll be no sad farewells, there'll be no tear-dimmed eyes. Where all is peace and joy and love, and the soul of man never dies. We are dismissed.